The story begins on a highway packed with honking cars, caught in a traffic jam. One of the drivers wonders what caused the delay and why a clear road is suddenly blocked. Glancing in the side mirror, the driver notices our boy walking steadily through the center of the highway and is struck by his unusual presence. The driver considers stepping out to ask if there's been an accident ahead, but before he can, our boy leaps onto the roof of a nearby truck. Suddenly, a loud sound echoes from up ahead, drawing the attention of the drivers who begin exiting their vehicles. Above them, a massive gate is opening. Our boy shouts a warning for everyone to evacuate immediately, urging them to flee as monsters are about to emerge. Panic sets in, and the drivers abandon their cars, scattering in every direction and leaving him alone. Our boy readies himself, channeling a fierce aura into his sword. As monsters begin pouring from the gate, he takes a powerful swing, obliterating them in a single strike before any can escape. Moments later, reinforcements from the raider forces arrive. One of the raiders quickly senses something amiss, realizing that since the gate is still open, monsters should still be emerging. Yet, there are no corpses in sight. The raiders gasp in shock as they witness an advanced monster, known as the Quadra Drake, designated hostile creature number 43, emerge from the gate. Everyone in the area feels the intense pressure, aware that only the highest-ranked raiders, those of Goldmark level or above, are typically equipped to face such a beast. The Quadra Drake begins gathering flames in its mouth, preparing to unleash its attack, unaware that our boy is already positioned behind it. In one swift, decisive motion, he cuts the Quadra Drake in half, the impact of its massive body hitting the ground causing an explosive shockwave. The raiders stare in awe, wondering who this mysterious figure could be. Then, one of them spots the emblem on his jacket, a golden dragon, marking him as Lee Seaman, one of the strongest raiders. But before he achieved such strength, there was a different story, a story of his past self. Years ago, someone told Seaman, for some, taking a single step may mean nothing. But for those who have fallen, that step can feel like scaling a cliff. Remember, when helping someone who's down, even one word can be enough. The mysterious figure then told him seriously that he was not a coward. Those words brought tears to Seaman's eyes and changed everything for him. Since the appearance of monsters that tear humans apart, the world has been divided into raiders and non-raiders. Later, at the Raider Management Bureau, the receptionist informs him that he can go in now, to which he responds with a tense yes. Prospective raiders, or awakened ones, must regularly have their aura levels checked at the Bureau. To become a raider, they first undergo an awakening judgment to determine if they possess any aura, followed by a qualification exam. Only those with aura levels above a certain threshold are eligible to take the tests. Seaman knocks on the laboratory door and greets the technician inside. She greets him back, noting that since he's done this a few times, she'll skip the usual explanations. He nods in agreement. She then asks if he's aware that he'll need to enlist in the military next year, mentioning that his evaluations have delayed it, but they can't postpone it any longer. He confirms, saying he's aware of the situation. The technician then suggests arranging counseling for him, saying he can't continue like this indefinitely. Surprised, Seaman politely declines, saying he'd just like to take the test and leave. She agrees, reminding him of his military enlistment deadline. He lies down in the machine, and moments later, she informs him that his aura level is 103, unchanged from last year. Aura levels typically begin around 100 and gradually increase, but Seaman's level has remained stagnant since he was first awakened years ago. Despite all his efforts and training, that number has never budged. She hands him a form to sign, and he reflects on how he once believed he'd eventually reach his goal. But reality has been harsh. He stands up and thanks the technician. Hours later, night has fallen, and he returns to his cramped, messy, dimly lit room. Heading straight to his computer, he remembers the game rewards he was expecting. But instead, he sees a surprising notification. Qualification requirements confirmed. Confused, he clicks on the Transcendent Network button below it. His screen reveals a tip board, a special member board, and a general member board. Intrigued, he clicks on the general member board and finds it filled with posts from various people. Chuckling, he stretches, thinking that some of these posters must still be caught up in their high school syndromes and could use a dose of reality. Scrolling through, he leaves a teasing comment on Damu Guang's post, thanking him for his wise words but jokingly adding, he can almost hear something breaking, like his parents' backs. He humorously calls Damu Guang a basement dweller, advising him to take a walk outside. Closing the site, he hopes his comment snaps Damagwang back to his senses. Deciding to check the news, Seaman sees that the raider An Sung-jun's rank has been raised from gold to platinum, leaving him shocked and in disbelief at An Sung-jun's incredible achievement. As he read through the comments on the news, Seaman noticed people praising Sung-jun, which ignited his anger. His fists clenched as he recalled how he and Sung-jun had once faced each other daily, only for Sung-jun to crush him without mercy. Now, that same man had risen to the platinum rank, fueling Seaman's frustration even further. In a surge of irritation, he grabbed a note detailing his training regimen, 300 squats a day and an 8-kilometer run. Staring at it in frustration, he crumpled it, feeling that everything around him was becoming unbearably annoying. Turning to his laptop, he began typing, admitting to himself that he felt like a failure. He had dropped out of school, hoping to become a raider, yet after years of effort, he remained unqualified for even the basic exam. Just then, a notification flashed, confirming his qualification, leaving him puzzled as to why this mysterious site kept reappearing. Browsing further, he noticed a new member with the ID Wandering Beggar Kim Bonghak and curiously asked Bonghak why he'd chosen that name. Even suggesting with a hint of sarcasm that he might be financially struggling, Seaman playfully offered to donate some money, claiming he was a raider. Bonghak took offense, calling Seaman's comments impudent and questioning the term raider, speculating that it must belong to Seaman's dimension. He went on to ask Seaman's age, calling him brother in a familiar tone. Unfazed, Seaman asked Bonghak's age, to which Bonghak replied that he had stopped counting after reaching 140, noting that age held little importance for those considered transcendent. Amused, Seaman chuckled, finding Bonghak's dedication to his character intriguing. Continuing to scroll, Seaman noticed a comment from Grand Wizard Ileana, mentioning her desire to meet him and her plan to gather the necessary points for the encounter. Playfully, he responded that he'd locate her with ease, unaware that a strange force had started forming behind him. Feeling confident, he encouraged her to come meet him, oblivious to the portal materializing directly behind him. Suddenly, he heard a voice from behind, asking him what he would do if they actually met. Startled, he turned to find a woman floating inside the gate, her eyes fixed on him with a penetrating gaze. She demanded to know if he was the unemployed bum Lee Seaman. Shocked and speechless, Seaman struggled to process what he was seeing. She began to walk closer to him and looked him over, assessing him with a stern expression. With a frown, she observed him closely, intent on understanding the man she had come to meet. The woman stepped out of the portal, causing Seaman to scream in fear. Suddenly, a root shot toward him, wrapping tightly around his body. She told him to stop flailing, and though he closed his mouth in terror, he continued to struggle. Confused by his reaction, she asked why he seemed so weak. Stammering, he begged her to spare him, but she simply remarked that his skills were worse than a bug's and questioned how he even managed to connect to the transcendent network. She then flipped him upside down, teasingly calling him fatso and poking his face as she demanded to know his identity. He promised to tell her everything if she just let him down. She released him, and he dropped hard onto his room's floor. Dazed, he looked up at her and stammered out a question, asking who she was. She introduced herself as Liana, reminding him of how confidently he'd been talking earlier. She then asked if he'd been truthful about being a raider. He nervously clarified, explaining that he was on his way to becoming one. Annoyed, she demanded to know if it was true or not. He explained that in his world, people with aura hunted beasts and were called raiders, though not everyone could harness aura. He was an awakened one, so he did possess a bit of aura. Unconvinced, she ordered him to show it to her. With considerable effort, he managed to summon a small, flickering aura, but it faded almost immediately. Disappointed, she asked if that was all, leaving him confused by her expectations. Frustrated, she slapped his face, expressing her disbelief. Her power shook the room, sending scattered objects skidding across the messy floor. Overwhelmed by the force she radiated, Seaman realized she was truly a transcendent being, a power beyond human comprehension. She approached him, her expression fierce, and he cowered, covering his face and begging her to spare his life. Outside, someone knocked on his door, concerned, and asked if he was all right. He quickly assured them that he was fine. As they heard people outside discussing what seemed like an earthquake, Liana regained her composure. She muttered in frustration, lamenting that she'd used up all her save points because of him. Angrily, she demanded to know how someone like him had managed to access the transcendent network. Stammering, he admitted he didn't know and explained he just turned on his laptop. She questioned what a laptop was, so he pointed to the device on his desk, describing it as the thing with the light. Curiously, she inspected it, musing on whether it was this world's communication tool, then ordered him to keep explaining. He insisted that there wasn't much else to say. Noticing a pile of notes behind his laptop, she asked him to at least tell her about himself. He shrugged, saying there wasn't much worth sharing, that he'd been through a lot like everyone else and ended up like this. Sitting in his computer chair, she remarked on the pitiful state of his life, to which he reluctantly agreed. She surprised him by stating he must have tried his best at some point, asking if she was right. Her seemingly indifferent words held a hint of comfort, encouraging him to open up. Seaman shared that he was an orphan who'd been fortunate to be adopted by his current parents. He'd been evaluated as an awakened one in school, but severe bullying led him to drop out. After that, he began stress eating, and despite years of effort, his oral level hadn't improved in 6 years. Lina called his story dull, and he agreed with a resigned nod. She then rose, saying it was time for her to leave. He quickly stood, relieved, and echoed her sentiment. Heading toward the gate, she warned him that if he acted up on the bulletin board again, she'd come back to kill him, ordering him to post an apology. He nodded, assuring her he'd keep it in mind. Just before stepping through the gate, she paused, reminding him that while the world was inherently unfair, he was still human and had to live. She urged him to go out and make something of himself. He hesitated, then asked if they could ever meet again. With a smile, she told him that if he truly wanted that, he'd have to transcend himself. Then, she returned to her world. As the gate closed, Seaman picked up a petal she'd left behind. Understanding that she'd meant for him to one day stand as her equal, he stared at the petal, wondering if he, too, could one day become transcendent. A moment after placing Liana's petal among his notes, Seaman turned back to the Transcendent Network. Apologizing sincerely to the transcendent beings, he introduced himself respectfully as Lee Seaman, the unemployed bum, promising to share his intense thoughts and insight with them. Days passed, and watching the Transcendent Network became a part of his daily routine. One day, Seaman noticed Kion, the Black Lion, online and greeted him, noting it had been a while since Kion had posted a photo. Kion, born the son of a noble family's slave, had risen to fame as a mercenary with stolen swordsmanship after avenging his mother's death by his master. From that day on, Kion eliminated all noble bloodlines and emerged as the continent's strongest warrior. Seaman looked over a family photo Kion had shared from a recent trip and noted how much Kion's son resembled his parents. Shortly after, the sword demon Perzan, the continent's top swordmaster, greeted him. Seaman replied to Perzan, who playfully remarked on his quick response. Perzan shared that he'd developed feelings for someone and asked Seaman for advice on winning her heart. Amused, Seaman asked if Perzan had been feeling lonely lately. He suggested that Perzan try a heartfelt approach, starting with a compliment as simple as asking where she'd hidden her wings, implying she was an angel. Perzan, intrigued, asked about the wings, and Seaman explained it was a sophisticated play on words to imply admiration. Perzan was impressed, and Seaman added that if she responded with a smile, he could express that her smile made his heart feel as if it might explode. Enthusiastically, Seaman continued offering Perzan more tips on winning her over. Afterward, Perzan thanked him, promising that if his advice worked, he would save up points to visit him in person. Pleased, Seaman agreed, though the promise made him realize something important. Through his interactions with the transcendent beings, he had come to notice a distinct trait among them of their unwavering commitment. They never procrastinated, they always kept their promises, and they never backed down from challenges. In contrast, Seaman saw his own reality as one marked by hesitation and laziness. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered to himself, finally admitting that someone like him could probably never become a raider. Turning to the fridge, he grabbed a bottle of alcohol and drank deeply, then collapsed onto his messy sofa, his eyes filled with tears. Reflecting on his dashed hopes, he lamented that if things were going to end up this way, he never should have been given the hope of becoming a raider. Seaman had envisioned nothing else for himself, and he still yearned to become a true raider, to prove he hadn't been wrong about his dreams. But with his aura level fixed at 103 in 6 long years gone by, he could barely even pull himself out of bed. Seaman began typing on his laptop, composing a heartfelt post for the Transcendence Network, struggling over how to phrase his final sentence. With pain weighing on his heart, he took another drink and submitted his long post to the forum. Soon after, he lost consciousness from the alcohol. Hours later, a notification sound from his laptop stirred him awake. Groggily, he assumed he'd merely fallen asleep, but a sudden horror gripped him as he wondered if he might have written something strange in his drunken state. Rushing to open the site, he was surprised to find supportive comments from the Transcendent members. Lord Commander Jareth urged him to keep moving forward no matter what. Dragon Lord Lee Monkaiser reminded him that life was short and that even he had once faced similar challenges. Perzan encouraged him, promising to visit and have a drink together once he saved enough points, while Shadow King Demogling advised him that true strength could only come from taking that first step. Moved by their unexpected encouragement, Seaman thanked them all, unaware that a gate had opened behind him. Just then, a rough, iron-like voice addressed him, calling him the unemployed Bumlee Seaman. Terrified, he froze, not daring to turn around, guessing from the voice that it had to be one of the transcendent beings. Before he could react, he felt a hand on his back, and a powerful energy surged through him as the mysterious figure behind him spoke, acknowledging the struggles within him, his powerlessness, depression, weak resolve, and even a cursed constitution that slowly wore down both his mind and body. Pain shot through Seaman as he felt a sensation like snakes crawling over his skin, and he cried out. The figure revealed that his ailment was known as severed veins. As the transcendent being read deeper into Seaman's memories, he came across one where Sung Jin had scornfully told him not to show off. This memory made the transcendent pause in surprise. Seaman managed to turn slightly, and the figure noticed the determined grip of his hand, prompting him to ask if he truly hadn't given up yet. Withdrawing his hand, the mysterious man then transported Seaman to another place. As Seaman looked around in confusion, the man introduced himself as Doko Chinmay, the greatest martial artist in history. He commanded Seaman to declare that he was no coward. Seaman felt an overwhelming power radiating from Chinmay, a strength so intense it seemed capable of making the world itself bow. While he had previously been in awe of Grand Wizard Lyanna's power, Chinmay was truly on another level. Chinmay instructed him to gather points and access the tips board, mentioning he had left something there specifically for him. Just as Chinmay turned to leave, Seaman tried to stop him, shouting for him to wait. But in an instant, he was back in his room, hitting the floor with a thud. Quickly getting to his feet, he wondered if the encounter had been a dream, but a lingering sting on his arm confirmed it had been real. Remembering Chinmay's words about courage, Seaman's body trembled, but he felt an unexpected lightness and decided it might finally be time to clean his room. Hours later, the room was spotless. The kitchen was organized, the trash was bagged, and every corner was bright and clutter-free. Satisfied with his work, he looked at his hands and thought that now, the only trash left in the room was him. Taking a moment, he looked at Lyanna's pedal, reminding himself of the meeting and the words he'd been told. Zipping up his jacket, he hesitated by the door, but then gathered the courage to step outside, repeating to himself that wasn't a coward. A short while later, he found himself ravenously eating fried chicken after running for 10 minutes, surprised by his hunger. However, seeing the food he'd already devoured, he realized it wasn't enough and decided to go for another run. As he paused to catch his breath, he acknowledged that his goals felt overwhelming to tackle alone. Then, he noticed a gym nearby and decided to check it out. Entering the gym, he excused himself, only to be stunned at the sight of an older man with a massive build lifting an enormous barbell. Seaman was still dazed by the impressive sight when another man approached, asking if he was new in here to work out. The older man introduced himself as Coach Kim Deokbi, and Seaman introduced himself in return. Deokbi immediately noted, with some amusement, that he could smell chicken on Seaman, leaving him confused. Deokbi then asked if he'd just eaten, admonishing him for thinking he could start working out right after a cheap meal. Seaman stammered an apology, but Dickby grabbed his shoulder, urging him to start warming up, and told him that since he had come all this way, he should begin right away. Seaman, intimidated, quickly agreed. As they began, Dokby noticed something and touched Seaman's arm, remarking that he seemed to have done some exercise before. Seaman admitted he'd done a little in the past, to which Deokbi enthusiastically slapped his back, encouraging him that he had a solid foundation and that they would work together to get him back in shape. Soon after, Seaman found himself on the treadmill, running as if his life depended on it, completely exhausted. Dokbi asked if he was tired, and Seaman stammered that he just needed a brief rest. Dokbi shouted back that if he felt like collapsing, he should go ahead and collapse. If he was meant to get back up, he would. He reminded Seaman that overthinking would hold him back from real change. Though too worn out to reply, Seaman pushed himself harder, realizing that his real obstacle wasn't a lack of aura, but rather a lack of confidence. Seeing this spark of determination, Dokbi yelled for him to keep going, even if it killed him. Seaman, with renewed grit, responded affirmatively. Hours later, aching and trembling, Seaman muttered that he was truly at his limit. But the old man from earlier approached him with a thumbs up, commending him for his effort and saying he'd see him again tomorrow. Appreciating the compliment, Seaman thanked him and felt a long-missed sense of accomplishment. Later, back in his apartment, Seaman logged into the Transcendent Network, feeling he'd made real progress that day, remembering Chinma's instruction to check the tips board. He clicked on the notice board but received a message that his access was denied due to insufficient points. Puzzled, he wondered how he could earn points, and the system displayed his current member quest to bring his weight down below 100 kilograms. Shocked, he exclaimed in disbelief, questioning how he was supposed to achieve such a goal. The next day, Seaman was back at the gym, running on the treadmill with a determined mindset to get his weight below 100 kilograms. His coach, noticing his dedication, shouted encouragement, telling him not to stop, even if it killed him. Seaman pushed himself to the limit, reaching 8.4 kilometers and shouting to fuel his motivation. A few days later, Seaman stood in his bathroom, examining his reflection and wondering if he'd managed to shed a little weight. Convincing himself to give his best that day, he headed outside and began running toward the gym, mentally preparing for some light cardio and interval training. As he ran, a woman passing in the opposite direction noticed him. At first, when she saw him, she thought a wild boar was charging toward her, but then realized he looked noticeably slimmer. Later, while doing pull-ups, Seaman chanted to himself that strength only came from starting and reminded himself repeatedly, with gritted teeth, that he was not a coward. Even though his muscles ached with pain, he continued pushing himself. The woman, now nearby with her water bottle, observed his effort and approached as he took a break to drink. She commented on how hard he was working, mentioning that she'd noticed his frequent visits and found his dedication rare. Seaman, still catching his breath, simply acknowledged her comment and mentioned he'd heading out, leaving her taken aback and irritated that he'd leave right after she'd gone out of her way to talk to him. Resuming his run, Seaman caught a faint scent of a raider in the air, likely lingering from the woman. Based on her scent, he guessed she'd at least surpassed the blue mark. Raiders possessed physical and athletic abilities far beyond those of ordinary humans, and even blue mark raiders, the lowest grade, held significant power over regular people. Seaman reflected on his trainee days, recalling the unbridgeable divide between raiders and ordinary humans, and even among raiders themselves, a hierarchy that felt like an insurmountable wall. Suddenly, the woman turned in his direction and sprinted toward him, easily catching up before darting past him. She turned, teasingly called him fat uncle, and waved as she ran off, taunting him that no matter how hard he worked, it wouldn't make much of a difference. Her comment left him frustrated. That evening, back in his apartment, Seaman went straight to his laptop. Curious about the day's posts on the Transcendent Network, he spotted a post from Liana and thought back to how intimidating she had initially seemed, only to find that she had a surprisingly kind side. Shaking his head, he reminded himself that Liana was far beyond his reach and turned his attention to his quest. Clicking the quest to check his weight, he closed his eyes and silently hoped he'd reached his goal, but the scale displayed 100.02 kilograms, just over the mark. Frustrated, he sprang to his feet and rushed to the bathroom, wondering if he could shed that tiny bit extra to finally break 100 kilograms. After emptying his system completely, Seaman weighed himself again, only to see the scale reading 100.0005 kilograms. Frustrated, he shouted in exasperation, calling it petty and maddening. Determined, he sniffed and coughed to rid his body of every last drop of water. Finally, the notification confirmed he'd reached 99.9 kilograms. As a reward for completing his quest, he received 100 points on the Transcendent Network. He saw that the tips board required members to be level 2 or higher, which could be unlocked with exactly 100 points. Excitedly, he upgraded his level and clicked on the tips board, amazed at the wealth of advice shared by various members. The system explained that reading a post on the tips board would cost 100 points, while posting cost 200 points, but he could earn 10 points for each view his post received. Shocked by the intricate setup, he marveled at the possibilities. Browsing, he noticed a post titled, "Learn to Grow the World Tree with Liana," which caught his attention. Then the system notified him that as a first-time visitor to the tips board, he could read one post for free. Thrilled, he selected the post titled, "Void Severance" from the legendary martial artist, Heavenly Demon Doko Chinmin. The post described Void Severance, the ultimate path of void manipulation. It explained that Kai originates in the lower dantian and must circulate through the body to complete one full cycle. However, individuals with disrupted meridians couldn't sustain this cycle as their inner energy dissipated like smoke. Reading this, Seaman was astonished, realizing this was precisely his condition. As he continued, his eyes teared up. Chinmin's post revealed that with the correct cultivation method, one could restore inner energy flow and escape this weakened state. Chinmin had imparted this transcendent skill to him, encouraging him to revere it and to follow the prescribed incantation. Seaman obeyed, reciting the words to invoke the taijutsu flow, the name of this divine skill. Afterward, he sat quietly, reflecting. Until now, he had viewed aura as something to dominate and control. But Chinmin treated aura as if it possessed a will of its own, a living essence to be understood and guided, a revelation that felt like the answer he'd been searching for all along. After 3 months of rigorous physical and mental training, Seaman sat on the bench press, focusing intently on controlling his aura. The ultimate supreme training had proven incredibly challenging, but he reminded himself that if this method could finally free him from his limitations, he'd endure it 100 times over if needed. Leaning forward, he resumed focusing his aura, visualizing the precision of threading a needle, just as Doko Chinmei had taught him. He recalled Chinmei's words about aura. It flows like water and spreads like roots. Concentrating on the blocked points in his circulation, Seaman pushed forward, attempting to break through in a single powerful surge. Suddenly, he felt his aura flowing freely through his head and hands. With a shout of excitement, he realized he'd done it. Though he collapsed back onto the bench in exhaustion, he smiled, knowing he was getting stronger. Later, at Tyson Academy, a private raid training facility, the coach was watching students train when one of them informed him that someone was there to see him. Coach Ah Chuang Jong-hoon hurried to the entrance, where he was greeted by a familiar face. Overwhelmed, Jong-hoon congratulated Seaman, expressing his pride and saying he'd always believed in him, regardless of whether he became a raider or not. Hugging him warmly, Jong-hoon suggested they grab a drink to celebrate. Calling him brother, Seaman explained he was there for a different reason and demonstrated his newly flowing aura, leaving Jong-hoon stunned. Impressed, Jong-hoon quickly told the other students to continue self-training while he led Seaman to measure his aura. A short while later, Seaman was in the aura measuring machine, eyes closed as he waited for Jong-hoon's reaction. Jong-hoon urged him to look for himself, and when Seaman opened his eyes, he saw an aura level of 1034. Tears welled up as Jong-hoon congratulated him, saying his curse was finally lifted. Stepping out of the machine, Seaman marveled at just a month of consistent aura circulation using the ultimate supreme technique had achieved what he'd struggled with for years. Jong-hoon, equally astonished, asked how he'd managed to accomplish it. Seaman explained he'd simply followed advice from a chance encounter. Fascinated, Jong-hoon suggested they test his abilities further by sparring with a particularly overconfident student who relied too heavily on his aura level. Confident that Seaman could humble the student, Jong-hoon asked if he'd be up for the challenge, and Seaman agreed. Soon after, they were back in the academy training hall, with Seaman standing on the stage alongside Jong-hoon and his opponent. The student, Yu Jin-se, skeptically questioned Jong-hoon about sparring with Seaman and asked what Seaman's aura level was. Jong-hoon replied it was around 1000, prompting Jin-se to glare, wondering if Jong-hoon was seriously pairing him with someone who had just barely reached that level. Assuming Seaman was Jong-hoon's prized disciple, Jin-se introduced himself, and Seaman returned the introduction. They took their positions for an unarmed fight, and at the referee's signal, the match began. Jin-se immediately lunged forward, aiming to crush Seaman with raw aura alone. Seaman easily dodged, ducked his head, and countered with a punch to Jin-se's face. However, the impact sent a painful tremor up his arm, as though he'd struck a wall. Jinsei, noticing, teasingly asked if he was all right. As Seaman pulled back, Jinsei complimented him on having basic skills, then dashed forward, kicking Seaman with increased force and warning him that things were only beginning. The kick threw Seaman across the ring, but instead of standing, he waited as Jinsei charged again, certain he'd finish the match. At the last second, Seaman grabbed Jinsei's foot, lifting and pulling him off balance. Surprised, Jinsei found himself thrown to the mat, wondering if Seaman was using grappling techniques. Seaman slammed Jinsei onto the stage, aware that most raiders didn't spend much time practicing martial arts. Raiders typically fought monstrous creatures that weren't humanoid, making hand-to-hand combat skills less relevant. But here, it was a different story. As Seaman held him down, Jinsei attempted to kick him with his free foot, but Seaman swiftly jumped back, dodging the move. The students laughed, teasing Jinsei for kicking the air. Embarrassed, Jinsei quickly stood to face him again, his expression furious. Charging forward, Jinsei threw a punch, but Seaman ducked in time and countered with a powerful uppercut, knocking Jinsei back to the stage floor. Before Jinsei could recover, Seaman wrapped his legs around him and grabbed his arm, putting Jinsei in an armbar. Furious, Jinsei wrapped a strong aura on his hands and launched a punch on Seaman. The other students and Jong-hoon watched in panic, knowing the damage Jinsei's aura could cause. Remaining calm, Seaman, though frustrated, decisively snapped Jinsei's arm to prevent him from going berserk. Later, Seaman jogged through the streets, reminding himself not to get too excited. After all, Jinsei hadn't put in proper training or shown any real passion, and Seaman's win was simply the result of months of grueling practice finally paying off. Still, despite trying to stay humble, he couldn't hide the happiness on his face. The next day, Seaman was back at the gym, training his newly built muscles. He just finished a set with a heavy barbell and was catching his breath when he noticed two students at the entrance, staring at him in awe. They whispered to each other, wondering if they should approach him, and he noticed that one was holding a flyer featuring his own before and after transformation. Rising in silence, he flexed his muscles, pretending to comment on the heat. The students watched in amazement until one of them, wearing glasses, called him uncle. Annoyed, Seaman asked what he meant by uncle, prompting the student to correct himself, calling him brother, and asking if it was true that his body had transformed in just 3 months. Seaman replied proudly that it was. The student, eyes full of hope, asked if he too could achieve the same results. Seaman replied that the order was wrong. They had to start with respect. Just then, Coach Deokbi appeared behind them, pointing out that the students should pay their boss. The students turned in horror as Deokbi greeted them, calling them new members and gripping their shoulders tightly. Leading them to his office, he introduced himself, and though nervous, the students followed him. Moments later, screams of terror echoed from the office. Deokbi emerged shortly after, with the students looking thoroughly drained, and explained to Seaman that they committed to following his same training course. Seaman laughed, asking if Deokbi thought they'd last. Deokbi replied that they'd even signed an agreement showing unexpected determination. Seaman gave them a thumbs up and wished them luck, which they acknowledged with awkward smiles. Remembering something, Seaman checked his phone, opening his Transcendent Network account to browse the tip board for new martial arts techniques. He noted with curiosity that the site was accessible on mobile now, and found a technique titled The Beginning of Martial Arts Training, Jinyi Quan. Soon after, the two students lay exhausted on the gym floor. The one with glasses admitted he felt like he was already dying, even on the first day. Both of them glanced over at Seaman, who's stretching his arm. They watched in amazement as a faint blue aura radiated from his body, realizing he must be a raider. The student with curly hair remarked that Seaman was like a senior to them, and the other student nodded in agreement, awed by his dedication. Days later, Seaman was back at the gym, noticing strange gazes following him during his workouts. He soon realized it was the skinny, nerdy newbie from earlier, who had been staring at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Wondering why the kid was watching him so closely, Seaman assured himself that he wasn't interested in guys. Just then, the nerd approached him, catching him by surprise. The nerd confessed that he'd been observing Seaman for some time and had figured something out about him. Confused, Seaman asked what he meant. With a gleam of excitement, the nerd announced that he had discovered Seaman's identity. Stunned and a bit nervous, Seaman stammered, asking what the nerd meant by identity, only for the nerd to laugh and assure him he didn't need to hide it. Relieved, Seaman admitted that, yes, he was a raider. Relieved, the nerd wasn't asking about anything involving the Transcendent Network. Seaman clarified that he wasn't a formal raider yet, but would be taking the qualification test soon. The nerd, who knew the test was a month away, confessed he was envious and wished he could take it too. Surprising Seaman, the nerd displayed his own aura, explaining that he was also an awakened one. Curious, Seaman asked why he wasn't attending a raider academy. The nerd explained that his parents thought being a raider was too dangerous and wanted him to focus on his studies until he was an adult. However, he still wanted to build up his strength. He added that many top raiders had been late bloomers and that becoming a true raider required not just aura but countless hours of training and effort. The nerd then confidently stated that he would definitely become a raider. Amused, Seaman asked why he was so certain. The nerd replied with a grin, saying it was obvious. Being a raider was the top-ranked career choice among middle and high school students in Korea because it was a cool job. Smiling, Seaman asked if he could control his aura, and when the nerd said yes, he encouraged him to give it a try. Hesitant but eager, the nerd sat down and focused, attempting to control his aura while Seaman watched. Impressed, Seaman praised the nerd's technique, asking where he'd learned it. The nerd explained that he'd followed a beginner's course by Raider on Sonjong. Seaman chuckled, advising him to keep practicing since aura control was vital. Then, with a hint of encouragement, he told the nerd that they were in this together and that they should aim to reach the top. The compliment boosted the nerd's confidence, and he eagerly agreed, walking away with a huge smile, chatting animatedly with his friends. Watching the kid's excitement, Seaman felt it was a promising start for him. With renewed resolve, he slapped his face lightly, reminding himself to keep doing his best too. Later, back in his room, Seaman opened the next tip on the Transcendent Network, titled The Fundamentals of Aura Manipulation. Covering his mouth in excitement, he thought how just hearing the title made him eager to dive in. He mentally told Chinmat to wait a bit longer, grateful for the tips board, which was proving invaluable for honing his basics. Curious, he checked the general board and saw a post from Person, who mentioned he'd been busy dating lately and teasingly asked if Seaman was jealous. Liana, never one to miss a beat, commented, poking fun at Person's appearance and asking what dating even meant for someone with a face like his. Smiling, Seaman noted how peaceful the dimension felt with their familiar banter. He then searched for information on the upcoming Raider qualification test and saw that the in-depth test, considered the pinnacle of the exam, was random again this year. The in-depth test, known for its unique and unpredictable challenges, often determined the final result, as even those who passed the written, aura measurement, and combat evaluation sections could still fail this final stage. Recalling last year's test, he remembered there had been a debate section and wondered aloud how debates helped raiders, given the job was about fighting and killing monsters. Just then, he noticed a flyer advertising exclusive prediction questions for the in-depth test. Initially, he thought only overly cautious people would waste money on something like that. But after staring at the screen for a moment, he found himself calling the number on the flyer, asking about the price, whether the information was reliable, and if they had a contact within the association. When they provided him with the details, he immediately transferred the money, admitting to himself that he'd become one of those overly cautious guys. Setting down his phone, he thought to himself that he was now fully prepared, confident that soon the world would know the name Lee Seaman. The next day, Seaman was at the park, working out on a pull-up bar. He paused, sensing a familiar presence approaching. He turned to see the woman he'd encountered before, also out for a run. She noticed him as well and, despite his attempt to hide, approached him, mentioning that she recognized him. He stayed silent, so she commented on how much weight he'd lost, saying she almost didn't recognize him. Touting, he replied dismissively, telling her not to bother him and to continue on her way. Sensing his annoyance, she apologized for her past comment and introduced herself as Kim Siana. Begrudgingly, he introduced himself in return. Siana asked if he was a raider, and he replied that he was taking the test soon. She cheered him on, mentioning that she would be rooting for her company's rookie as well. Seaman responded with a hint of arrogance, saying that it sounded exciting. Irritated, she warned him not to underestimate her rookie, whom she called her company's next ace. Smirking, Seaman suggested they place a bet. When she asked what kind, he proposed that they see who wins, her rookie or him. That's all for today, guys. See you on the next upload.